to After Dark Chronicles, where the real stories come out. When the sun goes down, the truth comes up. Tonight's story. A man bought his dream house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Within weeks, the HOA president began targeting him. Fines for violations that didn't exist. Threats, harassment. Then she tried to foreclose on his house over unpaid fines. She thought she had the power. She thought he'd just pay up and go away. She was wrong. What he discovered when he fought back didn't just save his house. It exposed a criminal conspiracy, sent her to prison, cost her everything she owned, and freed an entire neighborhood from tyranny. This is the story of how one man took down an HOA dictator and became a legend. This is his story. This story comes from Reddit, posted by a 36-year-old man who learned that sometimes the person wielding the most power in your neighborhood is also the biggest criminal. Here's what he wrote. My name is Tom. I'm 36 years old. 3 years ago I bought my first house. It was a huge milestone. I'd saved for 10 years, worked overtime, lived below my means. Finally scraped together enough for a down payment on a 3-bedroom house in what seemed like a perfect neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, good schools nearby. The American dream. There was one thing I didn't pay enough attention to during the buying process. The house was in an HOA, a homeowners association. I'd heard horror stories about HOAs, but my realtor assured me this one was reasonable. Low fees, basic rules, nothing crazy. She was wrong. The HOA was run by a woman named PATRICIA Morrison. Everyone called her Pat. She was 62 years old, retired, lived 3 houses down from me. She'd been HOA president for 8 years, and she ruled that neighborhood like a dictator. I found this out 2 weeks after moving in. I was unpacking boxes in my garage when Pat knocked on my door. She introduced herself, smiled, welcomed me to the neighborhood. Then she handed me a packet, 30 pages of HOA rules and regulations. She said I needed to read them carefully, that violations would result in fines. I thanked her and put the packet aside. I'd read it eventually. Big mistake. A week later I got a letter in the mail. Official HOA letterhead. It said I was in violation of Section 4.7, visible trash receptacles. My trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. Fine, $50. I was confused. I walked outside and looked at my trash cans. They were next to my garage, barely visible. Every other house on the street had trash cans in similar positions. I checked the HOA packet Pat had given me. Section 4.7 said trash cans must be stored out of sight, except on collection days. Okay, fine. I moved my trash cans behind my fence. Problem solved. Or so I thought. 2 days later, another letter. Violation of Section 6.2. Unapproved lawn modifications. I'd planted flowers in my front yard. Native wildflowers, drought-resistant, beautiful. Apparently I needed HOA approval before planting anything. Fine. $100. I was annoyed now. These rules were ridiculous, but I didn't want trouble. I filled out the form to request retroactive approval for my flowers, submitted it to the HOA, got a response a week later. Request denied. The flowers were not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetic standards. I needed to remove them and replant with HOA-approved species. I looked at the approved species list. It was grass, just grass. No flowers, no plants, nothing interesting. The entire neighborhood was supposed to be uniform green lawns, like a golf course. I refused. The flowers were beautiful. They weren't hurting anyone. I wasn't going to rip them out just because some retired busybody didn't like them. That's when the harassment really started. Over the next 3 months, I received 14 violation notices. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My front door wreath was too large. My car was parked in my driveway overnight, which violated some obscure rule about vehicles needing to be garaged. My lawn was mowed in the wrong pattern. Yes, the wrong pattern. Apparently, lawns were supposed to be mowed in horizontal stripes, not vertical. Each violation came with a fine. $50, $100, sometimes $200. The fines were adding up. I was getting notices every week. I tried to fight them. I'd read the HOA bylaws cover to cover. Half the violations Pat was citing didn't exist in the actual rules. She was making stuff up. I wrote letters to the HOA board explaining this. Got no response. I requested a hearing. Was told the next board meeting wasn't for 2 months. I showed up to that meeting. There were 5 board members. Pat was president. The other 4 were her friends, retired neighbors who did whatever she said. I presented my case, showed them the bylaws, pointed out that the violations I was being fined for weren't actually rules. Pat smiled and said the board had the authority to interpret and enforce rules as they saw fit, that neighborhood standards could be enforced even if not explicitly written in the bylaws. The board voted 5-0 against me, all fines upheld. I left that meeting furious. This was insane. I was being fined hundreds of dollars for things that weren't even violations. And there was no accountability, no appeals process. Just Pat and her cronies making up rules and collecting fines. I talked to my neighbors, asked if anyone else was dealing with this. Most of them were terrified of Pat. They paid their fines without question, followed every rule to the letter. A few admitted they'd been targeted too. One guy said he'd been fined over $3,000 in his first year. He'd eventually just sold his house and moved, said it wasn't worth the fight. But I wasn't going to run. This was my house. I'd worked too hard for it. I decided to stop paying the fines. They were bullshit. I wasn't going to fund Pat's power trip. That's when things escalated. The letters started coming more frequently. Now they included late fees, 25% interest compounding monthly. A $50 fine became $65, then $80, then $100, and new violations kept piling up. My front porch light was on past 10 p.m. My garden hose was visible from the street. My house number font was non-compliant. It was relentless. After 6 months of this, I'd accumulated over $4,000 in fines and late fees according to the HOA. I still hadn't paid a cent. Then I got a different kind of letter. This one was from a law firm. It said the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid assessments, that if I didn't pay the full amount within 30 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. They were going to try to take my house, over made-up violations and bullshit fines. I couldn't believe it. I immediately called a real estate attorney, explained the situation. He said HOAs absolutely have the power to foreclose for unpaid dues and fines, that it happens more often than people think, that I needed to either pay the fines or fight this in court. Fighting in court would be expensive, but losing my house would be worse. I hired the attorney. His name was Richard Chen. He specialized in HOA disputes. He reviewed all my violation notices, reviewed the HOA bylaws and governing documents, and he agreed with me. Most of the violations were bogus, either not in the bylaws at all, or enforced selectively against me while other homeowners were ignored. He said we had a good case, but he also said something that changed everything. He said before we go to court, let me do some digging into the HOA's finances. In my experience, HOAs that are this aggressive about collecting fines are often hiding something. Richard requested financial records from the HOA. Under state law, homeowners have the right to review HOA financial statements. Pat tried to stall, said the records weren't readily available, said we'd need to wait until the annual meeting. Richard sent a formal legal demand, threatened to sue for access to the records. Pat finally provided them, a box of bank statements, receipts and financial reports from the past 5 years. Richard spent a week going through everything. Then he called me. He said, Tom, you need to sit down for this. Your HOA president has been embezzling, a lot. He explained what he'd found. The HOA collected dues from 87 homes in the neighborhood. Each home paid $300 per year in dues. That's about $26,000 annually. The HOA's legitimate expenses, maintenance, landscaping for common areas, insurance, were around $15,000 per year, which meant there should be a surplus of about $11,000 per year building up in the HOA reserve fund, except there wasn't. The reserve fund had exactly $200 in it. Richard dug deeper. He found hundreds of transactions that made no sense, checks written to vendors that didn't exist, receipts for services never performed, credit card charges for personal expenses, meals, vacations, home improvements, all paid for with HOA funds. Pat had been stealing from the HOA for at least 5 years. Richard's conservative estimate was over $400,000, but it got worse. Richard also discovered that many of the fines Pat had been collecting, not just from me but from other homeowners, were never deposited into the HOA account. She was pocketing them. She'd fine someone $200. They'd write a check to the HOA. She'd deposit it into her personal account. The HOA ledger would show the fine as unpaid. Then she'd add late fees. It was a scam. She was using her position as HOA president to extort money from homeowners and embezzle from the association's funds. Richard said this wasn't just a civil matter. This was criminal fraud, embezzlement, possibly racketeering. He said we needed to report this to the authorities. We contacted the state attorney general's office, white-collar crime division. They were very interested. They opened an investigation, sent auditors to review the HOA's financial records, interviewed homeowners, requested Pat's personal bank statements. The investigation took 3 months. During that time, Pat tried to continue business as usual. She sent me more violation notices, threatened foreclosure again, but Richard had gotten a court order blocking the foreclosure pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Pat was furious. She started telling neighbors I was a troublemaker, that I was trying to destroy the HOA, that I was putting everyone's property values at risk. Some neighbors believed her. Others were starting to ask questions. Then the state attorney general's office held a press conference. They announced criminal charges against Patricia Morrison. 12 counts of embezzlement, 8 counts of fraud, 2 counts of racketeering. The evidence was overwhelming. Over $400,000 stolen from the HOA over 5 years. An additional $80,000 in fraudulent fines collected from homeowners and pocketed personally. She'd been running a criminal enterprise disguised as an HOA. The press conference made local news. Patricia Morrison's face was on TV, her mugshot in the newspaper. The whole neighborhood found out what she'd been doing. The reaction was shock, then anger. Homeowners who'd been paying fines for years realized they'd been scammed. People who trusted Pat felt betrayed. There were calls for her to resign immediately. She refused, said the charges were false, that I had fabricated evidence because I didn't want to follow the rules, that the Attorney General was overreaching, but the evidence didn't lie. Bank records, forged receipts, personal expenses charged to the HOA credit card, video footage from her vacation to Hawaii, paid for with HOA funds. It was all there. The HOA board held an emergency meeting. This time it was packed. Every homeowner in the neighborhood showed up. People were furious, demanding answers, demanding Pat's resignation. Pat tried to maintain control, said she'd been a dedicated volunteer for 8 years, that she'd worked tirelessly for the neighborhood, that this was a witch hunt. Nobody was buying it. The board voted, 4-1. Pat was removed as president immediately. The one vote in her favor was her own. The board then voted to dissolve several of the more ridiculous rules she'd implemented. The lawn mowing pattern requirement, the ban on flowers, the overnight vehicle parking restriction, all gone. But Pat's legal troubles were just beginning. Her trial was set for 6 months later. In the meantime, she was out on bail. She'd posted $50,000 to get out of jail. She was ordered to stay away from HOA meetings and activities. But she still lived in the neighborhood, 3 houses down from me. I'd see her sometimes. She'd glare at me, like this was all my fault, like I was the villain for exposing her crimes. The trial was brutal for Pat. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Bank statements showing transfers from the HOA account to her personal account. Credit card statements showing personal purchases. Testimony from an accountant who'd helped forge receipts. Testimony from homeowners who'd paid fines that were never recorded. The defense tried to argue that Pat had made mistakes, but hadn't intentionally committed crimes, that she'd been overwhelmed managing the HOA, and had poor record keeping. The jury didn't buy it. After a 2-week trial, Patricia Morrison was found guilty on all counts. 12 counts of embezzlement, 8 counts of fraud, 2 counts of racketeering. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in state prison. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, $480,000 back to the HOA and affected homeowners, plus fines and court costs. Her attorney filed an appeal. It was denied. Pat was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Her husband, who'd sat silently through the entire trial, filed for divorce 2 weeks later, said he'd had no idea what she was doing, that he wanted nothing to do with her crimes. The state seized Pat's assets to cover restitution. Her house was sold, her car, her retirement accounts, everything. The money was distributed back to the HOA reserve fund and to homeowners who'd been victims of her fraudulent fines. I got a check for $4,200. Every bogus fine I'd been charged, returned with interest. Other homeowners got checks too, some for hundreds, some for thousands. The total restitution was about $300,000. The rest of what Pat had stolen was gone, spent on vacations, home improvements and luxury items that had already been consumed or depreciated. She'd blown through nearly $200,000 of other people's money on herself. As for me, my life got a lot better. The foreclosure threat was dropped. All my fines were refunded. The new HOA board, now run by reasonable people, approved my wildflowers retroactively, apologized for the harassment I'd endured. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. Without Pat's tyrannical enforcement, people started enjoying their homes again, planting gardens, parking cars in driveways, living like normal human beings instead of prisoners in their own neighborhood. I became something of a local hero, the guy who took down the corrupt HOA president. Neighbors would stop me on walks, thank me for standing up to her, say they wished they'd been brave enough to fight back years ago. The HOA itself was restructured, term limits for board members, financial audits required annually, transparency rules for all spending, and a formal appeals process for violations. The changes ensured no one could ever do what Pat did again. 2 years after Pat went to prison, the neighborhood held a vote. Should the HOA continue to exist, or should we dissolve it entirely? The vote was 73 to 14. The HOA was dissolved. We were free. No more dues. No more rules about lawn patterns or mailbox colors. Just people owning their homes and living their lives. Property values didn't drop like Pat had claimed they would. They actually went up. Turns out people want to live in neighborhoods where they're not constantly harassed and fined over nonsense. I still live in that house. I love it. My wildflowers are thriving. I park my car in the driveway every night. My trash cans sit right next to my garage, and nobody says a damn word about it. Because this is America, and I own my home. Not some power-hungry retired woman with a god complex and a criminal mind. Pat is still in prison. She'll be eligible for parole in 2 more years. I doubt she'll get it. And even if she does, she'll be 70 years old with a felony record, no money, no house and no husband. She destroyed her entire life because she couldn't handle having a little bit of power without abusing it. She could have just been a normal HOA president, could have enforced reasonable rules, reasonably, could have managed the HOA's finances honestly. Instead, she chose to be a tyrant and a thief, and she paid the ultimate price. Sometimes people ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Pat, if I think 8 years in prison was too harsh. My answer is always the same. No, not even a little. Pat tried to steal my house. She embezzled nearly $500,000 from my neighbors. She ran a criminal enterprise for years. She terrorized an entire neighborhood because it made her feel important. She earned every single day of that prison sentence. And honestly, 8 years wasn't enough, because the damage she did, the stress she caused, the money she stole, that can't be undone. People sold their homes and moved away because of her harassment. Others paid thousands in bogus fines they couldn't afford. One elderly couple nearly lost their house to foreclosure over violations that didn't exist. Pat ruined lives, and she did it with a smile on her face. So no, I don't feel bad for her. I feel proud that I stood up to her, that I hired a good lawyer, that I didn't back down when she threatened foreclosure, that I helped expose her crimes and free my neighborhood from her tyranny. Taking down Patricia Morrison is one of the best things I've ever done, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. But the story doesn't end with Pat's conviction, because what happened after she went to prison revealed even more layers of corruption. And by the time it was all over, 3 more people would face criminal charges, and an entire network of HOA fraud would be exposed. About 6 months after Pat was sentenced, I got a call from a detective with the State Attorney General's office, Detective Sarah Williams. She said they were expanding their investigation into HOA fraud and wanted to talk to me about something they'd discovered. I met her at a coffee shop. She pulled out a folder. Inside were financial records from 4 other HOAs in surrounding neighborhoods. She said, "We've been looking into Patricia Morrison's connections." Turns out she wasn't working alone. She was part of a network. Detective Williams explained that during the investigation into Pat's embezzlement, they'd found communications between Pat and 3 other HOA presidents in nearby communities. Email chains, text messages. They weren't just friends. They were teaching each other how to steal, how to hide embezzlement, how to create fake vendors, how to pocket fines without getting caught. It was like a criminal mastermind group, except instead of robbing banks, they were robbing homeowners associations. One of the other HOA presidents was a woman named Linda Chen. She ran an HOA about 10 miles from my neighborhood, 230 homes, much bigger than ours. According to the detective, Linda had been using Pat's playbook: fake violation notices, inflated fines, embezzlement from the reserve fund. But Linda had taken it further. She'd actually created a fake landscaping company. The HOA would write checks to Green Valley Landscaping for lawn maintenance services. The checks would be deposited into a business account. Except Green Valley Landscaping didn't exist. It was just Linda's personal bank account with a business name. She'd been running this scam for 7 years. The detective estimated Linda had stolen over $600,000. Another HOA president in the network was named Robert Hayes. His scam was insurance fraud. He'd file fake insurance claims for storm damage to common areas. The insurance company would pay out. Robert would pocket the money and never actually do the repairs. He'd stolen about $250,000 over 4 years. The third person was Margaret Russo. Her method was kickbacks. She'd award contracts for HOA maintenance and repairs to companies owned by her relatives. The companies would wildly overcharge. Margaret would get a cut under the table. She'd stolen around $300,000. Detective Williams said all 3 of them were being investigated now, and they were all in communication with Pat, sharing strategies, celebrating their success. One email from Linda to Pat said, "Just cleared another $8K this month from fake fines. These idiots never check the bylaws." Another from Robert to the group said, "Insurance company approved my latest claim, $15K for hail damage that never happened. Easiest money ever." They thought they were untouchable, that homeowners were too lazy or too scared to fight back. They were wrong. The State Attorney General's office launched simultaneous investigations into all 3 HOAs, forensic accountants, subpoenas for bank records, interviews with homeowners. Within 4 months, all 3 were charged with crimes similar to Pat's: embezzlement, fraud, wire fraud for using email and electronic transfers. Linda Chen went to trial first. Her defense was that she'd made honest mistakes in bookkeeping, that Green Valley Landscaping was a legitimate company she'd hired, and the fact that it was connected to her personal account was just a coincidence. The prosecution demolished that defense. They showed that Green Valley Landscaping had no business license, no employees, no equipment, no office. It was just a name on checks that went into Linda's account. They also showed emails where Linda explicitly told Pat she'd created a fake landscaping company to funnel HOA money. Linda was convicted on 14 counts, sentenced to 10 years in prison. Her house was seized. Her husband filed for divorce, just like Pat. Robert Hayes took a plea deal, pled guilty to 8 counts of insurance fraud in exchange for a reduced sentence, got 6 years in prison and was ordered to pay full restitution of $250,000. His wife stood by him, which surprised everyone. She claimed she'd known nothing about the fraud, that Robert had hidden everything from her. Maybe that was true, maybe not. Either way, Robert lost his freedom, his reputation, and every asset he had. Margaret Russo fought the charges, claimed the contracts she'd awarded to her relatives were legitimate, that they'd done the work and the prices were fair. The prosecution brought in independent contractors who reviewed the invoices. They testified that Margaret's relatives had overcharged by an average of 300%. A roof repair that should cost $5,000 was billed at $15,000. Lawn maintenance that should cost $200 per month was billed at $600, and Margaret was getting kickbacks. They had bank records showing transfers from her relatives' accounts to hers, labeled as loans but never repaid. Margaret was convicted on 11 counts of fraud and racketeering, sentenced to 7 years in prison. The combined restitution from all 4 HOA presidents, Pat, Linda, Robert, and Margaret, was over $1.8 million. The State Attorney General held another press conference, announced the takedown of what they called an organized HOA fraud ring. The story made national news this time. Major news outlets picked it up. Homeowners associations become haven for white-collar criminals. Retirees running multi-million-dollar embezzlement schemes through HOAs. It became a huge story, and it led to changes. The state legislature passed new laws, mandatory annual financial audits for all HOAs, criminal background checks for board members, transparency requirements, whistleblower protections for homeowners who report suspected fraud. The laws were nicknamed Patricia's Law, after Pat Morrison, whose case had started the whole investigation. In my neighborhood, life got even better. With the HOA dissolved, property values surged. People started renovating, adding unique touches to their homes, colorful front doors, creative landscaping, solar panels, things that would have been banned under Pat's regime. The neighborhood went from sterile and uniform to vibrant and diverse, And people were happier. I talked to my neighbors more. We had block parties, helped each other with yard work, built an actual community instead of living in fear of the HOA police. One neighbor, an elderly man named George, told me he'd been living in the neighborhood for 20 years. He said Pat's reign had been the worst 8 years of his life, that she'd fined him over $6,000 during her tenure, for things like his grass being a quarter-inch too long, or his mailbox post needing paint. He got a restitution check for $5,800. He cried when he opened it, said he'd given up hope of ever getting that money back. Another neighbor, a young couple with 2 kids, told me they'd almost moved because of Pat. They said she'd fined them repeatedly for their kids' toys being visible in the yard. Bikes, a basketball hoop, a swing set. Pat had claimed these were eyesores and violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. The couple had been saving up to move to a different neighborhood. After Pat was convicted and the HOA dissolved, they decided to stay. They loved their house. They just hated the tyranny. Now they could actually enjoy it. I kept in touch with Richard Chen, the attorney who'd helped me. He told me his practice had exploded after the PATRICIA Morrison case. He was getting calls from homeowners all over the state. People who suspected their HOAs were corrupt. People who were being harassed with bogus fines. People who wanted to fight back. Richard had become something of a celebrity in the anti-HOA community. He testified before the state legislature in favor of the new HOA regulations. He'd been interviewed on news programs. He told me he'd helped expose fraud in 12 other HOAs since my case, that the problem was way bigger than anyone had realized. I also started getting contacted by people, homeowners from other states, journalists writing articles about HOA corruption, a documentary filmmaker who wanted to feature my story. I did a few interviews, told my story, explained how I'd fought back and won. I wanted other people to know they didn't have to accept abuse from their HOAs, that there were legal remedies, that criminals like Pat Morrison could be held accountable. One interview I did was with a major newspaper. The reporter asked me, "Do you think HOAs serve any legitimate purpose, or should they all be abolished?" I thought about it carefully. I said, HOAs can serve a purpose, maintaining common areas, organizing community events, protecting property values through reasonable standards. But the problem is they attract power-hungry people, people who want to control their neighbors, people who see it as an opportunity to make money illegally. Without strong oversight and accountability, HOAs become vehicles for abuse. The reporter published my quote. It went viral. People shared it on social media. Anti-HOA groups used it in their advocacy materials. I got messages from hundreds of people thanking me for speaking out, sharing their own HOA horror stories. Some had happy endings like mine. Others were still fighting, still being harassed, still accumulating fines for violations that shouldn't exist. I tried to help where I could, connected people with attorneys, shared resources about how to request financial records, explained how to report suspected fraud to state authorities. I became an accidental activist. I never intended for this to become a crusade. I just wanted to save my house and plant my flowers. But once I saw how widespread the problem was, I felt obligated to help others. 2 years after Pat went to prison, I got a letter from her, handwritten, from the state correctional facility. I almost threw it away without reading it. But curiosity won. I opened it. The letter was long, 5 pages. Pat wrote about how prison had given her time to reflect, how she realized she'd let power go to her head, how she'd justified her actions by telling herself she was maintaining neighborhood standards, that the money she stole was compensation for her hard work as HOA president. She wrote that she knew now it was all bullshit, that she'd been a criminal, that she'd hurt people, that she was sorry. She asked if I could ever forgive her. She said she understood if I couldn't, that she didn't deserve forgiveness, but she wanted me to know she'd changed, that she was taking classes in prison, working on her GED, even though she already had a college degree, just to have something productive to do, that she was trying to be a better person. I read the letter twice. Then I wrote a response. I said, "Pat, I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. That's more than a lot of criminals do. But I don't forgive you. You tried to steal my house. You stole from my neighbors. You terrorized an entire community for years because it made you feel powerful. You can't apologize your way out of that. I hope you do become a better person. I hope you leave prison and live the rest of your life honestly. But you and I will never have a relationship. You're not my friend. You're not someone I feel sympathy for. You're just a criminal who got caught and is now serving time. That's all you are to me. Take care." I mailed the letter. I never heard from Pat again. 3 years after the conviction, something amazing happened. The neighborhood, my former HOA neighborhood, won an award. The city recognized us as Community of the Year for our transformation from an oppressive HOA to a thriving self-governed neighborhood. We'd organized volunteer cleanup days, started a neighborhood watch program, created a community garden where Pat's old house used to stand. The new owners had bought the property at auction, demolished the house, and donated the land to the neighborhood for the garden. It was beautiful. Vegetables, flowers, a little pavilion where we'd hold gatherings. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Pat's house, the symbol of her reign of terror, was now a place of community and growth. The mayor came to present the award, gave a speech about how our neighborhood was a model for community engagement and self-governance, how we'd overcome adversity and come together stronger. I was asked to say a few words. I kept it short. I said, 3 years ago, this neighborhood was a dictatorship. One person had all the power and used it to abuse everyone around her. Today, we're a community. We make decisions together. We help each other. We respect each other's property and autonomy. This transformation happened because people refused to accept tyranny, because we fought back, because we demanded accountability. And I'm proud to live here. The crowd applauded. It felt good, not because of the recognition, but because it was true. We'd built something better from the ashes of Pat's regime. I'm still in touch with several of the homeowners who were victims of Pat's fraud. We have a group chat. We share updates about our lives, celebrate victories, support each other when things are tough. We're bonded by shared trauma, but more importantly by shared triumph. We all stood up to a bully. We all got justice, and we all live better lives now because of it. One guy in the group, Steve, recently ran for city council. He won. His campaign was focused on HOA reform, on protecting homeowners from abusive associations. He credits his experience fighting Pat as the inspiration for his political career. He's now working on city-level ordinances to prevent HOA corruption. He's making a real difference. As for me, I'm living my best life. My house is exactly how I want it. Wildflowers in the front yard, vegetable garden in the back, solar panels on the roof, a bright red front door that I painted myself. No HOA telling me what I can or can't do. Just me, enjoying the home I worked so hard to buy. I got married last year. My wife loves the house, loves the neighborhood, loves the story of how we took down a tyrant. She jokes that I'm a local legend. I tell her I'm just a guy who refused to be bullied. We're happy. We're planning to start a family soon, raise our kids in this neighborhood, teach them about standing up for what's right, about fighting injustice, even when it's scary, about the importance of community and accountability. Sometimes I drive past the community garden where Pat's house used to be. I think about how different things could have been if I'd just paid those first few fines, if I'd moved away like some neighbors did, if I'd been too scared or too tired to fight. Pat would still be HOA president, still stealing, still terrorizing people. The fraud ring would still be operating. Hundreds more homeowners would be victims. But I didn't give up. I fought back. And because I did, 4 criminals went to prison. Nearly $2 million was recovered. New laws were passed. Dozens of other HOA fraud cases were exposed. An entire system of abuse was dismantled. That's not just personal revenge. That's public service. That's making the world a little bit better. And I'm proud of that. Proud that I stood up to Patricia Morrison. Proud that I saved my house. Proud that I helped free my neighborhood. And proud that I inspired others to fight back against their own HOA tyrants. This is what justice looks like. Not perfect, but real. Not easy, but worth it. Pat Morrison tried to steal my house. Instead, I stole her freedom. Fair trade. 5 years have passed since Patricia Morrison was sentenced to prison. 5 years since my neighborhood was freed from HOA tyranny. 5 years since I became, as my wife jokingly calls me, the HOA slayer. And in those 5 years, the ripple effects of that case have been extraordinary. What started as one man fighting bogus fines has become a national movement. I never set out to be an activist. I just wanted to plant flowers and live in peace. But sometimes, life pushes you into a role you never expected. And sometimes, that role changes everything. The laws that were passed in my state, the HOA transparency and accountability reforms, have become a model for other states. 12 states have now passed similar legislation, all because of the Patricia Morrison case. All because one fraud investigation exposed a systemic problem that nobody had been paying attention to. I've been invited to testify before legislative committees in 3 different states. I tell my story. I explain how HOAs can be weaponized by bad actors, how retirees with too much time and too little oversight can destroy lives, how the lack of regulation creates opportunities for embezzlement and abuse. Legislators listen. Some of them have HOA horror stories of their own. Some represent constituents who've been victimized. They pass laws, they create oversight, they protect homeowners. And every time a new law passes, I think about Pat sitting in her prison cell. Her crimes didn't just destroy her life. They changed the legal landscape. She wanted power. She wanted control. Instead, she triggered reforms that stripped power away from people like her. The documentary about my case aired on a major streaming platform 2 years ago. It was called The HOA Nightmare: How One Man Took Down a Criminal Empire. The filmmaker interviewed me extensively, interviewed my neighbors, interviewed Detective Williams and Richard Chen, my attorney. They even tried to interview Pat in prison. She refused. The documentary was a hit. Millions of views. It sparked conversations about HOA reform nationwide. Social media exploded with people sharing their own HOA stories. Some were funny, some were infuriating, some were heartbreaking. But they all had a common thread. HOAs give small amounts of power to people who shouldn't have it, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. After the documentary aired, I was contacted by a publisher. They wanted me to write a book, a comprehensive guide to fighting HOA abuse, how to recognize corruption, how to request financial records, how to report fraud, how to organize your neighbors, how to dissolve an HOA, how to protect yourself legally. I spent a year writing it. The book came out last year. It's called Your Home, Your Rules: How to Fight HOA Tyranny and Win. It's become something of a Bible in the anti-HOA community. I get messages every day from people who've used strategies from the book to fight back against their HOAs. Some have successfully dissolved their associations. Others have gotten corrupt board members removed. A few have even uncovered embezzlement and reported it to authorities. One reader, a woman named Jennifer from Arizona, used the book to expose fraud in her HOA. She'd been getting fined for violations that didn't exist. Sound familiar? She requested financial records, hired an accountant to review them, found that her HOA president had been embezzling for 4 years, about $200,000. She reported it. The president was arrested, convicted, sent to prison for 5 years. Jennifer sent me a thank you letter. She said my book gave her the courage and the roadmap to fight back, that she'd saved her home and her sanity. Stories like hers make everything worth it. The stress of the original fight with Pat, the time I spent writing the book, the media attention I never wanted, all of it, because people are getting justice. People are taking control of their homes and their lives, and tyrants are being held accountable. I also started a non-profit organization. It's called the HOA Accountability Project. We provide free legal resources to homeowners fighting abusive HOAs. We connect people with attorneys who specialize in HOA law. We help fund forensic audits when homeowners suspect embezzlement but can't afford to investigate. We've helped over 200 families so far. We've exposed fraud in 37 HOAs across 15 states. We've recovered over $3 million for homeowners. And we've helped dissolve 23 HOAs that were beyond reform. The organization is funded by donations, by people who've been helped and want to pay it forward, by people who believe homeowners shouldn't have to live in fear of their HOAs. Richard Chen, my attorney, is on the board of directors. Detective Sarah Williams advises us on how to recognize and report financial crimes. We have accountants who volunteer their time to review HOA financials. We have attorneys who take cases pro bono. We have a hotline where people can call for advice. We're building a network of people who refuse to let HOA tyrants win, and it's working. Every month we get reports of corrupt board members being removed, of embezzlers being caught, of neighborhoods being freed. It's a movement, and it started in my front yard with some wildflowers and a refusal to back down. My neighborhood has become a tourist destination. Not literally, but people drive through sometimes just to see it. The community garden, the colorful houses, the tangible proof that life after an HOA can be beautiful. We've been featured in magazines, urban planning journals, architecture blogs. We're proof that neighborhoods don't need HOAs to maintain property values, that people, when left to their own devices, will generally take care of their homes because they want to, not because they're forced to. Our property values have increased by 28% since the HOA dissolved, not despite the lack of rules, but because of it. Turns out people want to live in neighborhoods where they have freedom, where they're treated like adults, where they're not constantly looking over their shoulders waiting for a violation notice. I recently ran into someone who'd been on the old HOA board, one of Pat's enablers, a woman named Dorothy, who'd voted with Pat on every decision, who'd upheld every bogus fine, who'd helped enforce the tyranny. She was at the grocery store. We made eye contact. She looked ashamed. She walked over, said she wanted to apologize, said she'd been swept up in Pat's orbit, that Pat had made her feel important, that she'd gone along with things she knew were wrong because she didn't want to lose her position on the board. I listened. Then I said, Dorothy, you had a choice. Every time you voted to uphold a bullshit fine, you chose to hurt your neighbors. Every time you stayed silent when Pat made up new rules, you chose complicity. I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change what you did. You were part of the problem. And you only feel bad now because Pat got caught and you're facing social consequences. If she'd gotten away with it, you'd still be on that board, still ruining lives. Dorothy started crying. She said I was right, that she was ashamed, that she'd lost friends over her role in the HOA, that people in the neighborhood still looked at her with disgust. I said, good, you should feel ashamed, and you should spend the rest of your life making amends. Volunteer, help people, do something useful, instead of wielding petty power over your neighbors. She nodded and walked away. I don't know if she took my advice. I don't really care. She made her choices. She has to live with them. As for the other former board members who'd enabled Pat, most of them moved away. Couldn't handle the shame of being associated with her crimes. One guy, Tom Hendricks, actually reached out to me a few years ago, said he wanted to help with the HOA accountability project, that he wanted to make up for his role in the corruption. I told him we'd consider it if he was willing to publicly admit what he'd done and apologize to every homeowner he'd hurt. He declined, said that was too much to ask. I told him then he wasn't actually sorry. He was just looking for redemption without accountability. That's not how it works. Pat Morrison is still in prison. She was denied parole last year. The parole board said she hadn't shown sufficient remorse, that she'd been involved in altercations with other inmates, that she'd violated prison rules multiple times. She'll be eligible for parole again in 2 years. I doubt she'll get it then either. She's not handling incarceration well, and honestly I don't care. She made her bed. She can lie in it. Her ex-husband remarried, moved to a different state, wants nothing to do with her or her crimes. Her adult children, who I learned about during the trial, have disowned her. One of them wrote an op-ed in the local paper about growing up with a mother who was obsessed with control, who made their childhood miserable with rigid rules and punishments, who valued appearance and power over love and kindness. The op-ed was heartbreaking. It painted a picture of Pat as someone who'd been a tyrant long before she became HOA president, someone who'd been abusing power her entire life, just in different contexts. I think about Pat sometimes, not with anger anymore. That faded years ago. Now I think about her with a kind of clinical curiosity. What makes someone like that? What drives a person to steal from their neighbors while pretending to serve them? What internal void is so deep that it can only be filled by wielding power over others? I don't have answers. I'm not a psychologist, but I know that people like Pat exist everywhere. In HOAs, in offices, in government, in families. People who crave control, who see kindness as weakness, who will abuse any authority they're given, and the only way to stop them is to fight back, to refuse to be victims, to demand accountability. My son was born last year. We named him Oliver. He'll grow up in this neighborhood, in this house, with wildflowers in the front yard and vegetables in the back. He'll play in the community garden that stands where a tyrant's house used to be. He'll never know what it was like to live under Pat Morrison's reign, but I'll tell him the story when he's old enough. I'll explain that his dad fought a bully and won, that sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone, that justice is possible, but it requires courage, that bad people with power can only be stopped by good people who refuse to back down. I hope he never has to fight the kind of battle I fought. I hope he never encounters a Patricia Morrison. But if he does, I hope he remembers that his dad didn't run, didn't hide, didn't pay the fines, and hoped the problem went away. His dad hired a lawyer, gathered evidence, reported the crimes, testified in court, and won, completely and totally. I want Oliver to know that victory against tyrants is possible, that the legal system, for all its flaws, can work when you have evidence and determination, that criminals can be held accountable, that communities can heal and thrive after abuse ends. Last month, I was invited to speak at a national HOA reform conference. 2,000 attendees, homeowners, attorneys, state legislators, community organizers, all united by a common goal: ending HOA tyranny. I told my story for the 100th time, but it never gets old, because every time I tell it, someone comes up afterwards and says it gave them hope, it gave them a roadmap, it gave them the courage to fight their own HOA dictator. One woman told me she'd been fined $16,000 by her HOA for violations she didn't commit. She'd been preparing to sell her house and move, but after hearing my story, she hired an attorney, requested financial records, found embezzlement, reported it. The HOA president was arrested. The woman got her money back. She didn't have to move. She won, because I showed her it was possible. That's my legacy now. Not the house I saved, not the flowers I planted, not even the criminal I helped put in prison. My legacy is showing people they have power, that they don't have to accept abuse, that HOA tyrants can be defeated. That's bigger than me, bigger than Pat, bigger than one neighborhood in one city. It's a movement, and it's growing. Every day, more people fight back. More HOAs are dissolved. More criminals are caught. More neighborhoods are freed. And I played a part in that. I'm proud of that. Prouder than anything else I've ever done. Patricia Morrison wanted to steal my house. She wanted to break me, to make me an example of what happens when you don't follow her rules. Instead, I made her an example of what happens when you abuse power, when you steal from people, when you underestimate the person you're trying to bully. She's in prison. Her name is synonymous with HOA corruption. Her case changed laws, inspired books and documentaries, created a movement. She'll be remembered, but not the way she wanted. She'll be remembered as a cautionary tale, as the tyrant who got taken down, as the criminal who sparked a revolution in HOA accountability. And me, I'm just a guy who wanted to plant flowers, who refused to pay bogus fines, who hired a good lawyer and stood his ground, who got justice, not just for himself, but for hundreds of families, who helped change a broken system, who proved that one person, armed with evidence and determination, can take down a criminal empire. That's not revenge. That's not even justice. That's transformation. That's taking something broken and making it better. That's looking at corruption and saying not anymore. That's refusing to be a victim and becoming a victor instead. That's my story. That's Patricia Morrison's downfall, and that's why I'll never regret fighting back. Not for a single second.